On this episode, I am joined by my new co-host, Mr. Allan Alford from Alford and Adams Consulting. We're going to discuss supply chain threats and regulations, so stay tuned.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
Welcome to Below the Surface, the firmware and supply chain podcast. This is episode number 25. Mr. Allan Alford is here with us. Allan, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, sir. I'm glad to be here.
Allan, for our audience, give us a little background or your role here at Eclypsium, I guess, and then we'll dig into your background.
Okay, so yeah, I'm CISO at Eclypsium. Background-wise, I've been CISO, good golly, five full-time CISO roles.
Nice.
Launched my own consultancy after that, and now I do a couple of really just hand-selected, I only CISO for people I really love kind of things, and a little bit of strategic cybersecurity consulting, and a little bit of just this and that and the other, and Eclypsium is my chosen partner in crime.
It's awesome. Well, we're happy to have you at Eclypsium and on this show. I'm looking forward to all the things we have planned. Before we dive into it, Below the Surface listeners can learn more about Eclypsium by visiting eclypsium.com/go. There you will find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling the Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risks, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. If you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can sign up for a demo, all that at eclypsium.com/go. So, Allan, it's really nice to have you. We've got like a whole series basically planned of these new Below the Surface episodes. So I'm delighted to have you as my coach. So you also do a podcast as well.
Yep. I'm host of the Cyber Ranch podcast. Been doing that show for, good golly, 2.5 years now, weekly show. Before that, I was on Defense in Depth for 2 years. So I've been doing a weekly show for 4.5 years now.
That's awesome. That's awesome. How did you, tell me a little bit about your CISO journey. How did you come to be a CISO?
The first time was complete happenstance. I had an IT career. I was in IT for a good, 10 years or so, had made it to director level or just about director level. I think they were in the middle of promoting me when I was at a video conferencing company, and I was deploying the video conferencing gear in-house as the resident IT manager. I was in charge of deploying our own stuff, eating our own dog food, if you will. And I was constantly giving engineering feedback about their security posture. You guys need to change this and fix this and turn this off and turn that on and, all this kind of stuff. And one day, as I'm in the middle of getting my directorship in IT, a bunch of the engineering leadership showed up at my door, walk into my office and shut the door behind them. There were 3 of them. And I was thinking, oh my God, I've ticked off the wrong people. I've popped my mouth off too many times about their product and picking on it. And now they're here to read me the riot act. And what they were actually there to do was invite me to join engineering and lead up the product security effort over there in engineering. Their take on it was, instead of telling us after the fact what we did wrong, why don't you come fix it? So flash forward another 10 years, I've been doing product security, and the new CIO comes and taps you on the shoulder and says, hey, I understand you used to be one of us. How would you like to bring product with you and also do enterprise and be the CISO and be over all of it? So that was my first CISO gig. I got tapped on the shoulder and invited into the role.
Product security and enterprise security is obviously very, very different. Very different. I tend to, if I had to go down a CISO path, I would choose product security. I think. I don't know. What's your take on that?
I loved my years in IT, and back in those days, we didn't even have dedicated security roles in IT.
Yeah.
I'm old. But I was sort of the de facto security guy. Like all the projects that involved security, any new hardware and tools that were kind of security centric, kind of fell in my lap. And then I became an engineer overnight, and I did product security for 10 years, loved it, grew up on it, really got my security chops in that context. could not imagine being a CISO without that background. That background was so integral to the business, right? Like product security, you're aligned with the business. Enterprise security, you are more of a cost center, right?
Yep.
And so having that product delivery mindset, learning how to be secure while also trying to get product out the door on time, it's a whole different ball of wax from the IT side of the house, and it's an invaluable skill to get business aligned.
It's interesting how nicely it segues into our discussions on supply chain, because product security, you've got to deal with supply chain, but from a different perspective, obviously, than maybe enterprise may if they develop their own software, right? But in product security, you've got to tackle the supply chain threats, issues, vulnerabilities, the whole thing.
Everything you inherit is part of your product that you are in turn delivering to your customers, and that's every piece of open source code, that's every library, that's everything, the hardware, the software, the whole bit. I said I was at a video conferencing company. We produced hardware products with software in them, and I can't tell you how much stuff there was in that box that, FPGAs and Linux kernels running and all this goodness all crammed into an appliance, right? And as we progress in our conversation here, I think I'll be able to share some scary stories from that world. But suffice it to say, there are a million things plowed into any given anything today. I don't care if it's a firewall, a switch, a router, an IoT, a camera, anything. The odds are you've got a boatload of supply chain crammed into whatever that little device is.
Yeah, for sure. And we've been talking about that, so it's another great segue. And in the news recently and on our own blog, we've been both researching. So we've had some couple of pieces of research that we'll talk about and discussing really the implications of firewall and VPN vendors that, they basically are dropping off this, this box, magical mystery box in your network. And
Zero
I think,
touch.
right? But I think the CISOs and largely have to trust that they're going to do their due diligence. But there's so much to unravel in that.
Yeah, there is. And I think, we hear supply chain and we think the vendors I'm dealing with and the contracts I'm signing with those vendors and do you guys have good security practices and blah, 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 blah. We don't audit and edit and inspect to a granular detail everything we buy. We can't. We don't have the cycles for that. We just don't. There's a certain amount of trust but verify or trust but trust, depending on the degrees of what you're dealing with. But, something like a firewall, you're going to go buy an enterprise-grade firewall. You're just going to deploy it. You're going to configure it. You're going to harden it. You're going to go with the recommended manufacturer defaults for hardening it. But you're going to trust that it itself is doing its job, and that's not always a good place to put your trust.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not picking on vendors, right? I don't like to pick on vendors. If they're doing something I don't agree with, I'll state my opinion, right? But we all live in glass houses, right? And I don't think it helps anyone for us to picking on someone is very different from discussing things you might not agree with, right?
Sure.
And so I want to use specific examples because we talked about it in our blog. Avanti has had a rough time recently. And I really think much of that stems from, I'm not creating excuses for them, but I think they have particular challenges that stem from a long history of acquisitions, right? And maintaining a product through those acquisitions and basically championing for enough resources to go, we got to go fix this really, we've pointed out in our own research and others' research as well, there's really old Linux stuff running on the devices. And we've all been there. Dealing with legacy stuff is hard, but I think they are specifically challenged, right? Because of the acquisition history could be one thing.
No, that's definitely a factor. Look at the other recent one we had that was a similar story was Pulse Secure. Was Juniper Pulse, was whatever Pulse, was its own thing, was bought, was sold, was spun off, and they turned out to have whatever, I forget the time period on it, but whatever kernel they were running was ancient, right?
Yeah, but as consumers of this, we like to trust. We should be able to trust and have them provide some validation that what's in there is more secure. Without, like you said, if we're to, as an enterprise, evaluate, so we're going to go decompile all the firmware and take a look at everything inside of it, I don't think that should be a job of enterprise, right? We need to rely on partners such as Eclypsium and others to do this, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. There's nobody on my team has time and cycles to do that for every single thing we bought. Not to mention that by the time they get halfway through the list, somebody in the shop has already gone and bought a whole bunch of new stuff. I mean, it's like chasing after SaaS accounts that individual employees are signing up for. You get a master list, and the next day it's already changed by 20%. Even if you had the resources to tackle this problem, you would never get there.
Right. So what's you're close to the CISO community, and I love this in our conversations on this show and future shows. We can tie in that CISO perspective, which is nice. What's the current kind of thinking of CISOs when we've had this news cycle basically for the past year? It's been pretty heavy on firewall and VPN appliances. What's the discussions feeling like?
I think CISOs are waking up to this one. Like I said, supply chain has historically meant, we can go ahead and drop some vendor names like Black Duck. Like, let's audit what my source code libraries are in my own software, or contracts with vendors, and let's hold them accountable and make sure they've got a SOC 2 and make sure they fill out our questionnaires. Like, supply chain security has always historically fallen under one of those two kinds of buckets. And what we're realizing is that's not deep enough, right? And, the name of the show is Below the Surface. The million-dollar question is, what supply chain nightmares are lurking below the surface? There's great white sharks swimming down there. And historically, we haven't been touching that. And I think the wake-up call has come. And it's long overdue. I remember back in 2002, there was a news article about Cisco switches. Some supplier chain, some VAR chain for Cisco had somehow introduced bootleg Chinese cards. The giant cards you used to slide in there. I'm sure they still pretty much work the same way, but this was back in the days when everything was physically huge. These cards were actually being manufactured in China, slipped in through the VAR network. They weren't real Cisco parts, but they were being slid into Cisco devices. And the article went on to list some of the entities that had discovered these cards in their midst, and like U.S. Navy intelligence was one of them.
Right.
And you have to ask yourself, okay, so the first sort of recoiling at this was, oh my God, I got cheap inferior gear that isn't the real thing. How can my warranties work and all this? And somebody else finally pointed out,
that's a problem. That is a problem. We don't want to discount that, but that is one problem.
That is one problem. And then someone else pointed out, like, guys, every packet you have is passing through this device of unknown Chinese manufacturer. And that's when light bulbs started going off. And this was 20-something years ago, right?
Yeah, and that's still a problem. The similar problems today, although the hardware supply chain it's so many levels of challenges that we have, right? The hardware supply chain is one, and then the software and firmware supply chain, right, that comes on there. And is there a backdoor? Has it been tampered with? And how do we validate that? And that's really the challenging question. I'm going to put you on the spot maybe a little bit, Allan, right? But how do we independently evaluate the supply chain of these devices that contain intellectual property, that the vendors have taken measures to go, well, you shouldn't be able to look under the covers because, again, they're protecting their intellectual property. They're trying to keep people out from tampering with it, but that has the side effect of it's harder for researchers to go in and look and then validate, is this thing really running what you say it's running?
Yeah, clever researchers will always find a way. But again, back to where does that role lie? That role doesn't lie on the IT team. That role doesn't lie on the CISO's organization. That role doesn't rely, on product security or anybody else in your shop. You've got to have outside researchers who specialize in this kind of thing. It's the only way I know to crack that door open and ask those hard questions and get the right answers back. Folks like this is an Eclypsium show. Folks like Eclypsium are doing this at a dynamite pace. The researchers at Eclypsium floor me on a routine basis with how they take the uncrackable and crack it, how they take the undecipherable and decipher it, how they take the encrypted and decrypt it. These guys are pros. This is what they do, and this is all they do. We have a whole team of really clever folks that are doing just that 24/7, right? So that's the only way I know of, honestly. This is part of why I signed up with Eclypsium. When I said, I handpick who I CISO for, there's a reason I chose Eclypsium. This is some really killer stuff, and it's overdue. The problem started 20-something years ago, like I said. We're overdue on this one big time to have somebody like Eclypsium helping out the entire industry. And I think the industry is finally starting to acknowledge, oh, dear, we do have a real problem here.
Yeah, I feel like this is a dusty corner, right, that you're not necessarily paying attention to for maybe both sides, right, supplier and the consumer. In this case, the enterprise is the consumer. But it's a dusty corner because you may not know that there's a vulnerability there. And again, I don't want to pick on Zixil, but this is a case. And it's not the first time I've seen this particular case, specifically dealing with hardware and firmware, where there's a vulnerability that's discovered but doesn't get a CVE, it
Right.
may or may not get an acknowledgement from the vendor
Right.
that a vulnerability was fixed, because in this case, the functionality was removed that introduced the vulnerability from version 1 to version. It's not version 1, version 2, but
Yeah,
from
whatever the
version to
current version
yeah.
was no longer had the vuln, so they didn't feel the need to issue the CVE. But the reality is, who updates their stuff?
Right. It's
I mean, back to my video conferencing days. One of the product management assessments they did when we were trying to figure out why people aren't buying the new cool hotness that we had produced, we discovered that people were buying gear 10 years ago and never updating it and still running it exactly as is 10 years old. I mean, this is common for the folks that buy the stuff to be on the older versions. So to say, well, the new version's already fixed it, we don't need to disclose, is reckless.
Yeah, because it's like running on the assumption that, like you pointed out, well, people always should update their firmware or their software on these appliances. But you and I both know that's not always the case, right? I think those listening are probably like, yeah, but that definitely is not the case all the time. Now, there are organizations that are probably really good at it, and I applaud you, but to me, that's not the norm, right?
No, it's not. And even, I mean, I'm a security practitioner and have been for 20, 25 years now. I can't guarantee all my stuff is up to date right now, this exact moment. I mean, I can't. There's too much stuff.
And there's operational risk to updating these devices, especially ones that are firewalls and VPNs. VPNs is kind of a great shining example of not just operational risk, but operational downtime, right? Because typically, if you're going to have to kick everyone off the VPN to apply the update to reboot the device, and then everyone's got to rejoin. So there's if you're using that technology,
might break something.
And then it could break something, right? That's that operational risk looming that we go, I don't know if I want to update that. But if we don't know that it fixes a security vulnerability, we're not able to make that informed. I may still decide that I'm not going to update today, right?
I'm balancing risk.
Yeah, but I should be able to do that and make an informed decision, and I don't have all the information. And that's why I thought our post on Zixa was really good, because we're raising that awareness that this is why you should we're giving that information.
Yeah, and for the audience, what happened was we at Eclypsium found it. We politely informed them and asked for, hey, do the public disclosure thing. They didn't do the public disclosure thing. They ignored us basically, or said we're not going to do it. I don't know which it was, but they didn't do it, and so we ended up responsible disclosure ourselves. That's a sad state of affairs right there. It shouldn't have to have been us.
I mean, they did fix it, so there's that.
Yeah. No, it was already fixed. It was already fixed.
Yeah. It was already fixed, right? Yeah.
So I don't know. Disclosure matters. Again, people don't update. Every shop I've ever been in, every CISO role I've ever had, every systems admin role I had, even back in the IT days, there's legacy stuff that nobody wants to touch. Everyone's afraid to touch because it might break the thing, and no one even knows how the thing is wired up or who wrote the thing anymore, or the guy that built the thing is gone, or whatever the story is. There's always legacy stuff. And it's reckless to say we have this window where we knew there was a major vulnerability, but since we've already closed that window, we're going to pretend it doesn't exist anymore in the real world. I can guarantee you, if you go on Shodan, you'll find a huge swath of people still on that version.
Yeah, and I've also heard stories where it comes through via acquisition. Like, oh, do I have this technology? Oh, wait, I do, because this company that we acquired, they had that technology, and we can't just go rip and replace everything immediately when we do an acquisition. That takes time. Like, Allan and I have both been in IT for a long time, right? That stuff takes time.
Yep. Yeah, it's, mergers and acquisitions, all kinds of crazy stuff happens. I remember I worked for one company where they bought a company equal to their own size. So suddenly they were double overnight, and half the shop was Palo Alto and half the shop was Checkpoint. And, those kinds of things. Some of them were using this VPN, some of them were using that VPN, and trying to integrate all that stuff, mix and match, figure out best of breed, how to crosstalk until you get there. There's 1,000,001 operational challenges that, do you think anybody was updating any of that gear during that time? Probably not. They were too busy trying to integrate, not update.
Allan, do you have advice for CISOs today that are dealing with this challenge? Like, what would need to be improved upon, changed, or implemented in your existing programs to deal with this problem more effectively?
So most of us are not budgeted still for this layer, right? And this is where you get into, CISA, however you want to pronounce it, CISA.
It's CISA. I
CISO.
struggle with pronunciation on a lot of things, Alan.
Because there's CISO, CISO, CISO.
Yeah,
You
it
know.
is. Yeah,
All right, CISA.
it is
CISA it
CISA.
is.
Yeah.
All right. So those guys have got the known. What is it called? The known exploits and vulnerabilities database.
The
KEV.
the Kev list.
Yeah. So the KEV list. If you separate out the OS itself and look at everything above and below the OS, there are actually more vulnerabilities in the KEV below the OS than there are above the OS. Period. There's more stuff lurking beneath the surface than there is on top of it. The OS remains the big chunk as always, but once you remove that equation and look up and down actually has more stuff than up does, and yet we're not budgeted for down. CISOs are budgeted for EDR. They're budgeted for DLP. They're budgeted for firewall. They're budgeted for CASM. They're budgeted for CASB. They're budgeted for, there's 1,000,001 nooks and crannies and niches in this industry. We've all seen the market landscape charts with the 8 bazillion companies in the 8 bazillion categories. For some reason, historically, this one has been neglected, and it's long overdue. And I think we're at a nascent moment where we're going to see this spill over. I think more and more people are starting to wake up to what's going on. You've got your UEFI, you got your FPGA. I mean, heck, we even had Spectre and Meltdown on the CPU itself, right? You've got your GPUs running stuff with everybody that, AI, come on, it all runs on GPUs. What are GPUs? More attack surface below the surface, right? So I think there's a wake-up call for all CISOs, and I think a lot of them already are waking up on their own. But this is big. And this needs to be addressed in a meaningful way. And I think my advice to CISOs is do budget for this. Next year's budget, start thinking hard about where you're spending your money, because there's more stuff below than above.
I've been keeping tabs on this trend, and these are gross generalizations, right? But there are today great protections in the operating system. Well, we'll go to Windows first, right? And I have some evidence to kind of back up why attackers are kind of moving around some of these protections, right? Because like you said, enterprises largely are budgeted for EDR. Now, there's tons of EDR bypasses out there, but it does make an attacker's job harder, right? I mean, if you talk to pen testers, they're like, yes, we do have our bypasses, but it makes you operate. It changes your operation when you're attacking systems that have EDR. Forget about if they have like really well-tuned EDR. It's challenging. Not impossible, but it's challenging. Windows operating system itself has many protections that are helping, that are forcing, in my opinion, attackers to start going around that. And the trend that we're seeing is malware that's diving deeper before the operating system into things like bootloaders, into things like UEFI. And one of the things that they're doing that is common in pretty much all of the malware that I've seen at this level is they're using it to disable protections in the Windows kernel and in the Windows operating system.
Yeah, they are.
Right, and that's
come in below. You can alter what's above.
Right, so they're disabling driver signing.
Yeah,
that's great. Now I can load drivers in the operating system, and I don't necessarily have to go below to accomplish my goals, and I can persist more. I can disable more protections that way. And so there's a laundry list of protections that are being disabled. Yep. This to me is very concerning. You talk about why we work at Eclypsium, right? This is one reason why I wanted to come work at Eclypsium, because I think this trend is we've seen it continue with Glubteba, which is a horrible malware name. Not new malware.
That's the world's worst.
Isn't it? It's a terrible name. I couldn't figure out easily where it came from. Maybe someone listening will email us or something and be like, this is where it came from. I couldn't tell where the name came from. I tried to do some research, but it actually has a pretty long history. So there's a lot of information to sift through to kind of get to who named this originally and why is it called Glubteba. But that aside, it adopted newer mechanism, or a new to Glubteba mechanism for getting into the bootloader, so a bootkit functionality. Now, it's not terribly advanced, right? It's one of those ones that concerns me, but not as much as it could if it adopted even more functionality, because a full system rebuild does wipe away this malware. So that's good.
Yeah.
Secure boot does kind of thwart it. It also thwarts it as well. It kind of takes into account that you maybe don't have secure boot enabled. So you've got some mechanisms. Of course, rebuilding all your systems is not fun.
Yeah, we're back to that ease of use question and conversation, and we're back to that. What do people really do? Do they update? Well, think about what happens when you need to restore your Windows box. What do you do these days? you click on the restore Windows capability. It doesn't alter
Right.
those partitions. It takes a full drive wipe to wipe
Correct. Yes, it's a
Glubteba
great
out.
point. Yeah, it's a great
It takes a
point.
full drive wipe, and nobody does full drive wipes anymore unless you're, I mean, like Linux heads will do that, and people like me will go in and completely nuke it. But all those default Windows partitions, you've got your boot partition, you've
Yep.
got your memory partition, you've got all the other crap going on that Windows does by default. Any default reinstall is going to leave all that stuff
It's
intact.
going to leave the EFI partition intact, which could leave the malware intact.
Exactly. And it, I mean, I remember rootkits, right? Rootkits 15 years ago were the new hotness. All the antivirus was, helpless in the face of rootkits because it was one layer below where the AV lived. Well, now we got bootkits, which is substantially below that even. It's a never-ending story that the closer you get to the hardware, the more you can bypass all the traditional controls, bottom line.
Right. And, and it's interesting, too, there was a recent story about, that ran in Ars Technica that was talking about a vulnerability that Microsoft didn't patch for 8 months or something like that. And it was, admin to kernel is what they call it, right? So, yes, I'm an administrator on the box, but there's like this extra step I need to take to get to kernel, escalate privileges even more. Microsoft traditionally has been like, look, there's not a lot of protections from admin to kernel. Like, it's not our job. Like, if attacker's that deep, like that, but they did fix this one. And I think more and more as we see those types of vulnerabilities or exposures closed off, attackers are going to even more so move to a bootkit, to embedding inside of UEFI, because you're forcing their hand now. Hopefully.
Yeah.
Hopefully. I mean, that's what we should be doing, is pushing attackers around. It is slightly more advanced to go in there and do the bootkit thing, and certainly a lot more advanced to get something inside of UEFI.
Yeah, it is. And I would argue that the ideal circumstance, like the ideal state from the defender's capability, right? We want to get it to where the bad guys have to have physical access. Like if we can do that, we've won the game. You will never, ever, ever, ever escape the fact that physical access is physical access. But if we can drive them down that low, that's pure win, right? And we have to get through the bootloaders. We have to get through the UEFI exploits. TPM2, we're going to find a hole in that sooner or later if we haven't already. I haven't kept tabs on that one, but I'm sure it's
interesting.
coming.
There was, and it's interesting. It doesn't garner a lot of attention, but the research team at Quark's lab discovered vulnerabilities inside the firmware of the TPM.
Of course.
But I have not seen that exploited in the wild necessarily. I'm not saying it's not happening, but it certainly does happen down to that level as well.
Yeah. I'm just waiting for the day somebody figures out how to pop Google Authenticator.
Yeah.
Every one of these technologies we truly rely on, sooner or later, somewhere down the road, some clever somebody is going to figure out a way to exploit it.
Absolutely. So secure boot is important. When we've been saying that since the dawn of time at Eclypsium, right? And our research team and founders have a long history of identifying issues with secure boot and helping us fix those issues. The vulnerability in Shim certainly is an interesting wrinkle in that secure boot, and we're kind of at the point now where we're waiting to see what comes next. Like, how are we going to address this issue, right? We need DBX updates. We need new versions of Shim to be deployed, but we need the DBX update, the DB update. Microsoft's talking about new PKs and roots of trust for secure boot. So I think it's a good kind of public service announcement for everyone listening that there's changes coming. So be prepared. Yeah. And secure boot is, and while there are obviously workaround or vulnerabilities and attackers who are moving around it, make them work around it and enable it in your environment, because it does thwart a number of threats.
Yeah, it does. And it's important to note, too, with Shim, everybody thinks, oh, well, if you know what Shim is, everyone thinks, oh, that's a Red Hat thing, right? Well, Red Hat maintains, but that Shim code exists all over the place.
Even outside of Linux, too. It's interesting. I had some feedback when we were publicizing it, because we were, kind of leading that charge. And I did see people kind of complaining, this isn't necessarily a Linux thing. Don't say that this is a vulnerability in Linux. This is a vulnerability in Shim. And yes, Linux uses it, but a lot of other operating systems could also use Shim, because it's not, it's a UEFI application.
It's OS neutral. It's below the OS.
So interesting to see, but I think the resounding advice is make sure you have secure boot. And if you're in a Windows environment, it is much easier, obviously, than a Linux environment to set up secure boot and maintain it moving forward, right? Microsoft has a lot of great facilities that are like do that. It basically in the normal course of operations.
Yep, and I think there's you got the VM abstraction layer that's a whole nother conversation. That's a rabbit hole we could go down. But you also talk about things like parallels and all these other tools for multi-boot on the same system. And oh yeah, this stuff matters in a lot of places in a lot of ways all the time. And VMs sometimes are actually leveraging directly that same hardware for their boot. It just depends on the way things are configured and set up. But it impacts way more than you think it does. You can't just say, oh, it's a Red Hat thing or oh, it's a Linux thing.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting too. I learned that because I think we think I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I think that most people boot their systems in the same way. And coming to work here and kind of digging into that layer, I've realized that there's a lot of different ways in which people can configure their systems to boot, right? And we've seen vulnerabilities in Pixie boot. We've seen vulnerabilities in UEFI HTTP boot that existed in Shim. And in researching these vulnerabilities, Allan, I'm hearing people saying, well, I configure my systems this way to boot. And therefore, either I'm concerned or I'm okay because my specific design and architecture is more resilient. So there's a lot of different ways people are booting their systems.
Yeah, and it goes up and down the stack too. Even Grub has had stuff over the years, right? And I mean, and I mentioned parallels. That's probably ancient technology by now. I'm sure there's alternatives for that. But any multi-boot loader is going to be toggling some of this stuff at a layer that's vulnerable.
Right.
Yeah.
It's one of the things I do recommend that people do, and it's one of the, I hate to talk about our product directly, but put that aside and just take it for an architectural thing. I like to know when things like my bootloader change, right? So however you do that, yes, our product does that, but I don't want to make a product pitch, but as just the notion of, I want to know, I want an alert if a bootloader changes, and I want to couple that with, has it changed? And there was no operating system update, right? There was no update, approved update to that means someone's tampering with, is there a new bootloader? Has a bootloader changed? All those things need to be monitored. And there's a few ways to do that, but I think that's an important indicator today as we talk about attackers moving to this level. I think that's a really important indicator.
Version tracking, checksumming, right? Integrity checking, because sometimes too, you may go to the real website or think it's the real website and download the BIOS update, right?
Right.
And then load it up on your system and be running on what is actually, it's just like the Cisco cards that were Chinese made, right? You can have a not real BIOS that you're running as your real BIOS and it does all the things you expect your real BIOS to do, but it's also got some bonus code, right? It's important to have that integrity checking across the board. And I'll tell you, day one at Eclypsium, I'm not kidding you. I said, give me the product. How do I get, I want to run this stuff on my own home network. Give me. I'm going to learn and explore and see exactly what the product is doing. And I ran it across my home network and I put it on, 5 or 6 machines. Every one of them red flagged on something that my normal processes and tools didn't catch.
I had the same exact experience when I started here at Eclypsium. It's really funny.
Reds everywhere. Every
you and I think I'm doing a pretty good job maintaining my systems, and then we start looking at all these other areas and wait, no, I'm missing stuff. This is bad.
You got a known vulnerable BIOS. You got an illegit BIOS that isn't signed correctly. You've got I had all kinds of stuff going on.
Yeah. Now BootGuard and other technologies from Intel are designed so that doesn't happen. But of course, if you go back through the history of all the security research, there's ways around it. And then there's also the case where we've talked about this on previous shows. If someone loses a key, right, that root of trust that should make sure that your UEFI is not tampered with can go out the window. Now, fortunately, that's not the norm. But it has happened, and it could happen again in the future. So
yep. Where there's a key, there's a hack. Right.
That's it. So I wanted to talk a little bit about regulations as we talk about acquiring this hardware, software, firmware, and how do we validate it against a known standard, and where do regulations come in? I wanted to get your thoughts first on the new EU regulations, the CRA. And but it's not fully, it hasn't like taken effect yet. I think they've made some strides. There was input from the EFF and Linux foundations and some guidance there, and I think they did make some changes, and it's looming. But I don't know if you've dug into it, Allan.
Just a little bit. It's kind of like in the early days of GDPR, when everyone first started hearing about GDPR, it wasn't even actually ratified yet, right? And we're all freaking out, and you had to go read it in detail and memorize it and learn it, and then also look at the case law that sort of built it and case law that wrapped around it, and then the first rulings came down the pike, and blah blah blah. We're in that similar kind of boat where it's time to do the deep digging and reading. And I'm sure my buddies over at Open Source Software Foundation, I'm sure those guys had a hand in this one too. I haven't even checked in with them on that one, but it's time for me to do the deep read and get to that stage. So I don't really have a lot of opinions at this stage. I've just glanced, but it feels like, I'm a Texan, and Texans, as a rule of thumb, don't like regulation.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. We have this debate all the time. Regulations can be good, they can be bad, and it depends on exactly what they say.
Sometimes they are the true and only driver in this industry in a moment in time when we desperately need it. Some of these new SEC regs and the reporting that everyone's having to do right now, that's a wake-up call. Like, I'm glad to see these filings going through from all these public companies that are filing their first ever. Yeah, and here's our cybersecurity posture. We kind of have to, it was long overdue. Too many people were able to sweep things under the rug. That was regulation that shine. It's shining a light in, to your point, dusty corners, right?
Right.
So if the regulation can shine a light on a dusty corner, or better yet, encourage us to clean the dust out of the corner even better, then I'm not so anti that regulation, as long as it's not being heavy-handed, draconian, and all the other good caveats apply.
Right. It's interesting because it impacts product security and potentially in this way. And I'm not sure exactly what the final regulations are going to say, but currently, one of the items in the CRA is you cannot sell a device, hardware, software, whatever, in the EU if it has known vulnerabilities.
Right.
Now, again, that could change. Like, what I said may not be exactly true once it's fully ratified, right? But that's kind of the vibe I'm getting right now. And let's just go with that.
Down.
If that was the case, wow, that has some interesting ramifications. And the ramifications that I think folks like OpenSSF are concerned with, and myself too, while I like that as a regulation, because I feel like, again, when we take these appliances and we plop them in our network, maybe they have to go through some certification that looks for known vulnerabilities and gets a stamp of approval. This doesn't have any known vulnerabilities. Talk about how we maintain that going forward. But it could also be that the vendors now are like, well, we don't want to discover any known vulnerabilities in our stuff, so stop looking there, because then we won't be able to sell them in the EU.
Well, and think about every security contract that's ever been signed, every security clause in every purchasing contract that's ever been signed between two companies. And I've been on both sides of this fence a bajillion times each, right? Yeah. I'm the guy demanding that the vendor sign my paper and swear to my security needs, and I'm the guy being the vendor and signing and swearing to the security needs. Well, every single one of those contracts, at some point, there's a chart. It's a little table, and the table says criticals will be fixed within X, highs will be fixed within Y, mediums will be fixed within Z, and everyone stops at mediums.
Right.
Informationals, nobody addresses, nobody cares about. And yet, if the law is that draconian and that black and white, that means informationals have to be addressed too. Nobody does that.
It's true, but then it comes down to how we derive at those severity levels. Which is
where people start
whole different
gaming
podcast.
the system and all that stuff too. So better to have criticals, highs, and mediums defined well and make an edict around those. Informationals, not as big a concern. I mean, it's the old story about 15 informationals can stack up and equal a medium if the right circumstances occur. But the reality is, most systems that classify them as informational, and that might be your scanner, that might be your whatever's going on, they're informational. Like, hey, by the way, it's not the best practice in the world. You might want to fix this when you have some time, but it's more that category. And consistent methodology, we don't have that. We don't have that anywhere. I mean, this is the classic CISO conversation of, can risk even be measured? And if so, is likelihood and impact the right categories for it? And if so, is that actually an ordinal scale? And et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a million and one rabbit holes we can go down with this one. But at the end of the day, if we can all agree generally what a critical high and medium are, then yeah, we should be fixing that stuff.
Yeah, and I also think there's a difference between a component that you're including in your product having a known vulnerability versus your own code. And we might need to make some delineations between there, because certainly consuming something that a component, maybe from open source, that like it has a known vulnerability. It's already been publicized, it's been scored, it got a CVE, and you bring that in, or one is publicized after you bring it in. That is somewhat of a different process from there's a vulnerability in my own code.
Oh, absolutely it is. And this is where, I was having a conversation with Yuri, our CEO, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I am not a marketing person, but I was like, we got to come up with some paradigm for S-bomb. Like everyone knows what an S-bomb is, and then we've got B-bombs and H-bombs and F-bombs, and it could be firmware, it could be BIOS, it could be hardware. Like we almost need to break the industry into this model where the S-bomb metaphor is extended all the way down the stack.
Mm-hmm.
And getting something like that created so that when you purchase your thing or deploy your thing or put together your thing or whatever it might be, whichever role in the supply chain you have, what you've inherited, right? And at a bare minimum, let's at least increase that awareness. Let's get the bombs working up and down the stack, right?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I'm a fan of the bill of materials for sure. It's all in how you use it and act upon it. I think is super important, because I think in the early days, people are like, oh, well, we have an S-bomb and then we're good. I'm like, no, but like someone needs to look at that and make decisions based off of that, and then compare it to an S-bomb being generated once the product's delivered versus when it's in development, and there has to be some validation of the S-bomb. Provided we have some of those facilities, I think it's a step in the right direction, right?
Full agreement. The bill of materials, I mean, it all started with bill of materials, BOM, which was back in the day an entirely physical thing. Then we morphed it to software, and like in between the old school physical bomb and the current S-bomb is a whole wealth of bombs that we need to be looking at.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's a case of like who generates them, who compares them, and in what segment and sector that we're doing that, right?
Trusted third party. Right. That's what we're
coming down to, and I think that's some of the suggestions for things like the EU CRA is that I kind of, and I don't know if it's going to end up like this again. This is just speculation, but like we kind of model the PCI model where you have your independent testers, right, that are attesting to your compliance with the standard. I think we need a similar thing for. You're making some kind of appliance, right? You have to go to a third party, has to be evaluated to a certain standard, and then you're compliant. Now, we all know it's a moving target, so is PCI, and we can deal with that. And you have to get recertified in the whole process. And again, with regulation,
you get tested for emissions.
Yeah, and you don't want to stifle innovation either by making it too hard for folks to attest. But I think that's where we're coming down to, right? Because we can't I don't think we can sustain we just acquire stuff and then 6 months from now it's horribly vulnerable and my entire infrastructure is compromised. Like this is an avoidable situation in my opinion.
Yeah. It is. And it's, I mean, flip your laptop over and look at the 10 bajillion little symbols on the sticker on the back of it, right? Mm-hmm. Every one of those represents some certifying authority mandating some set of rules and the manufacturer attesting that they have met, or a third party validating that they have met whatever those requirements are. When I say emissions, I'm not talking about your car. I'm talking about electromagnetic fields coming off your device. Like one of those little symbols is we have tested for how much we put off, how much broadcasting in the airwaves are we doing off our device, and do we meet the minimum requirements? And hardware companies have testing machines and facilities and people, and it's all just part and parcel. They're used to it. It's a regulation that, it's a guardrail on your engineering, right? And there's some cases where not having that requirement would make it so much easier, right? But everyone's used to it. Everyone operates with it. Everyone's always done that for years and years and years now. So we're just talking about the same thing, really.
Right. Awesome. Anything else that you wanted to talk about today, Allan?
It just boils down to me, again, we're not budgeted for this stuff, and we should be. And it's mind-blowing to me that we're not. There's so many key areas in cyber, and we can complain all day long. We can talk about, there's already way too many categories, and every week a new category gets invented and everything else. this isn't about inventing a new category. This is about addressing a problem that's always been there.
Sure.
And that we're just now finally really starting to come to terms with as an industry. And it's not about a new category. We don't need some fancy new acronym to indicate, like, secure everything below the OS, guys. That should just be as default and as much as breathing, as EDR is. Everybody knows secure it above the OS. Everyone knows secure the OS. Everyone knows patch, vulnerability management, EDR, next-gen AV. We know all these things, right? We should be tackling this stuff, and we should be budgeted for this stuff, and we should be moving forward knowing this is a huge, huge, huge risk vector. Bigger, in fact, according to Kev, than the stuff we are fixing today.
Right, for sure. Well, Allan, thank you so much for joining today. It was a lot of fun. Coming up, we've got a lot of fun and interesting guests that we'll be bringing on the show with Allan and myself, so we're very much looking forward to that. So thank you, everyone, for listening and watching this edition of Below the Surface. We'll see you next time.